If you've got a cedar siding, if you've got a brick house, you're not blocking the radiation. You don't have metal. So again, realize there is radiation coming from the back of the smart meter. Now here's that other meter, the one they're starting with, GE. These are the antennas that GE got certified with the FCC. The pattern is a little bit different. It's more sort of like a figure 8, but again, there is radiation in all directions around the antenna. So what are the traits of radiation? This microwave radiation I keep talking about. Well, there's the way they talk about the intensity, the way they measure it, they call it power density. The reality is it does drop off sharply. The intensity drops off with increased distance, and they even have a mathematical equation for every time you double the distance, it goes down by 1/4. If you triple the distance, it goes down to 1/9. They've got an equation that measures how much you're going to be exposed to. So that's another statement that they make, is that, well, it's going to be dropping off dramatically, so you're not going to be exposed to that much. Well, here's the reality. One of the other aspects of this radiation is it bounces. These are waves that bounce, and they call it reflection, and it bounces off of hard, smooth surfaces like glass, concrete, polished metal, granite countertops. How many people have granite countertops? Think about your polished stainless appliances. Think about what a normal house looks like. Think about walking down a street. How many plate glass windows are you passing? How much concrete are you walking on? All of these surfaces are bouncing these waves. And what happens when these waves bounce? Emissions are additive. When they intersect, whatever the power is of each of those rays intersecting, it adds together. What if it's 3 rays intersecting or 5 rays intersecting? When they're bouncing, they're going all over the place. The reality is the exposure is a lot higher than what you would expect by their simple little equation that you back up so much and it goes down so much. There's a lot more going on. The other key part here is that damage done by the radio frequencies is cumulative over time. Sunlight is a form of electromagnetic radiation, and think about if you're out in the sun too long the first time in the spring, the first warm day, you get a sunburn. Well, you can take it easy with the sun, but guess what? People who are chronically out in the sun, golfers or farmers or people who get a lot of sun exposure, it's cumulative. Even if you're not getting burnt every time you're going out, the damage is cumulative. And that's true for this electromagnetic radiation. So every little bit you're exposed to, the damage keeps adding up. Now here's what's going on when your little smart meters are going off. And given that the rays are additive, each one of those red circles is the sort of the circle, the rays going out from your smart meter, and every time they add together, you can see the color darkens. When you have 2 circles overlapping, you see it's a little darker. You have 3 circles overlapping, it's darker still. Well, what about when we get to the future and it's always on? This is what it looks like. This has been referred to as electrosmog. You will be constantly bathed in radiation. And that's also not even considering, that picture wasn't considering all of your appliances always on. All the appliances in every house, as well as all of the smart meters, always on. We're looking at a heck of a lot of radiation. Now, this next diagram, this also came out of that Electric Power Research Institute report, and they were looking at recording this power density over time in a neighborhood out in a real town that had smart meters. I put the little stars on the tops of those blue spikes, and that's sort of the peak emissions, and this was in a mesh network. And again, they're not going off as often as this always on that we're going to get to, but so you have these peak emissions. The green is what is known as averaged measurements. That's how power density is measured. They average it over a 30-minute time period. So when you have a meter going off, and then a few seconds it's quiet, and then it goes off, and then it's quiet, all of those quiet zeros are added in with the big number. So the blue spikes are the real momentary spike of radiation. The green is when it's averaged. That's the numbers that get reported. Do you know how big the difference is? This is a logarithmic scale. This is like when you have earthquakes and you have the scale that goes up by 10-fold each time you go up. So every 10 increase on this scale is a 10-fold increase. You go from the top of the green to the top of the blue, it's 10,000 times. So your actual exposure is 10,000 times the numbers you're going to see quoted as measurements, because the measurements are averaged. Now, they will also tell you that people have been living with electromagnetic radiation since the beginning of time. There's all kinds of naturally occurring electromagnetic radiation. Well, that's true. The Earth puts out its own electromagnetic radiation. It's called the Schumann resonance. It's about 7.86 hertz. Your heartbeat's about 1 to 2 hertz. Sleeping brain waves, 2 to 4. Your awake brain, when you're actively doing something, is about 8 to 13. So overall, your human cells are vibrating with electromagnetic radiation at a rate of about 0 to 22 hertz. Notice these are small numbers. The above are known as extremely low frequencies, ELF. Also, they are continuous waves. These are waves that are going on without zeros in between, without silences. What you get with the electromagnetic radiation from man-made sources is pulsed. It's very, very different, and the effects on the body are very, very different. Here's your electromagnetic spectrum. Way off on the left are these little tiny ones that are what you have that is naturally occurring. Now, sunlight is naturally occurring, and that would be in the visible range, which is about in the middle of that chart. So yes, sunlight is a much higher frequency. However, it's also continuous wave. It's doing damage. You can get skin cancer, but it is continuous wave, and it's not as damaging as pulsed, and it's not as damaging as anything that's going up on the higher end, that ionizing radiation. But this is all non-ionizing radiation that we're talking about at the left end. So what does radiation do to you? What are the biological effects of the high-frequency electromagnetic? Well, for one, there's disruption of your cell communications. The testing has shown, scientific studies have shown, that the calcium ions that are involved in cells communicating with each other get disrupted. So the messages your cells are telling each other to turn a process on or turn a process off are going to be garbled. There's damage to DNA. It's not the kind of damage that you get from an X-ray. It's not breakage like a sledgehammer. It's more like breakage from a virus fed into a computer. It's a different kind of damage. It sort of melts the glue in the DNA, and it just sort of dissolves and the pieces come apart. It's a different approach, a different manner of breaking. It still breaks DNA. Lots of studies, scientific, peer-reviewed studies, have shown it breaks DNA. Broken DNA leads to long-term increase in cancer, and that's why as you get more and more broken DNA, as this damage is accumulating over time, you have a bigger and bigger risk of cancer. What the World Health Organization had said is that 10 years plus exposure to the cell phones could lead to cancer. It affects the, that's a good word, electroencephalogram and blood-brain flow. The idea here is that there is this sort of a sheath, a coating on your brain called the blood-brain barrier, and it's supposed to keep bad things out. However, electromagnetic radiation makes it permeable. And so when your body has small amounts of toxins in it that normally would never get to the brain because this sheath, this coating, protects the brain, it's not protecting the brain anymore. When you're exposed to electromagnetic radiation, you're much more susceptible to other toxins and diseases that are out there in the world. One of the other things studies have found is the creation of, they either call them heat shock proteins because they first looked at it in terms of heat, but overall they call them stress proteins. This study was called Reflex. It was a study done in 2004. What they found in this study is that the electromagnetic frequencies activate one of the instructions in DNA. The instruction says when something is threatening the cell, you put up your shield. The shield is a protein coating. So it's this existence of this protein that they call heat shock protein or stress protein. You see it when there's a chemical assault, you see it with a heat assault, you see it with EMFs. Your body is telling you EMFs are bad. EMFs are a threat to the health of the cell, and that's why they put in the heat shock protein. If there's unrelenting exposure, the cells put a thicker and thicker layer of this heat shock protein until nothing gets in and nothing gets out. No food gets in, no nutrients get in, and any of the waste doesn't get out, and the cell has premature death. So heat shock proteins are a way to protect itself, but unless they get a time period to recover, unless they get a break from this constant onslaught of EMFs, it's going to mean premature cell death. So what kind of symptoms do people experience? David talked about the electro-hypersensitivity, EHS, but there's a host of symptoms that people get. And David didn't touch on one of the other aspects of EHS, and that is studies have shown that more and more people are becoming electrosensitive, particularly in countries where they have had cell phones the longest. So in places like Norway and Sweden and some parts of Europe, they are finding the percentages of people with electrosensitivity are much higher. In fact, there was an Irish actually, it was an Irish presentation, but it was Oberfeld, I think is the name of the scientist who was from Austria, who did a study and tracked all these different countries where they looked at how many people, how many reports of EHS they had over time, predicted by 2017, 50%, 50% of the world's population will be electrosensitive. This is a reaction to the onslaught of the radiation. It's the sensitivity that's built up as your body is maxing out on its exposure. So the kind of complaints you see, the common ones, you have the cognitive ones. Concentration is disrupted, memory, behavior. Sleep disruption is a big one. Headache, depression, irritability, nausea. There's a whole bunch of symptoms associated. A lot of this is stuff you see with the EHS. All of these are related to changes in the electrical activity of the brain. Like we said, this is changing the communications, and it's changing what's happening in your brain. One of the things it's changing is it's suppressing the development of melatonin in your body, and part of that is if you can't sleep, you can't produce melatonin. Melatonin is primarily produced at night. So if you're not sleeping, you're not producing melatonin. And then all of those green boxes with all of those problems are cascading of what happens when your melatonin production is suppressed. Here's one of the other big issues. RF effects on children are much more than adults. Children's bodies are affected because they're smaller. Their bones are thinner. It penetrates deeper. They have a higher water content, and water attracts the electromagnetic rays. Their cells are rapidly multiplying, so when you get the DNA damage, those mistakes, those defective DNA strands are being multiplied many more times over. I was part of a study where some of the rays were measured, some of the smart meter emissions were measured in Naperville, Illinois. And we went by a school and we looked at what was the emissions on the grassy area and what were the emissions on the asphalt. And the asphalt was much higher because it's reflecting the rays, they're intersecting, and kids playing. It was really sad. There were hopscotch permanently painted on the asphalt, and of course there were basketball hoops, and kids playing on this asphalt are getting intensified EMF exposure. When you're looking at female children, girls are born with all the eggs they will ever have. If those eggs are damaged by radio frequencies, that girl may be infertile or have defective children. The defects that her DNA accumulates over time are going to get handed down through generations. It's not repairable. And the earlier the exposure starts, the higher the health risks. This is one of the specific studies that looked at, again, cell phones, 900 megahertz microwaves, but I had said earlier that the cell phone, the smart meters were like 850 and 1900, so it's in a similar range of electromagnetic frequencies. The one on the left is a 5-year-old child with a cell phone. The middle one is a 10-year-old. The one on the right is an adult. Look at how much deeper into the brain it penetrates on a 5-year-old child. The head is smaller, the skull is thinner, and there's a higher water content. This is what happens. This is a chart. It's a very busy chart, but if you look at the red circle in the upper right-hand corner, that's where the U.S. guidelines are for how much radiation you're allowed to be exposed to. What is it that Italy, China, Russia, Salzburg, Austria, New South Wales, Australia know that our government doesn't know? Why are their limits so much lower than the U.S. limits? The next set of boxes as you move left, the gray boxes, are a lot of the effects that you get from different levels of exposure. And you see at the top left it says power density. I told you that's how they measure your exposure to microwaves. So all those little gray boxes show you different interesting things like childhood leukemia, impaired motor function, reaction time is affected, memory, altered white blood cells, headache, dizziness, fatigue. All the way down on the lower left, Near the red box, sleep disorders, weakness, fatigue, pain. Look at the small amount of exposure that causes those kinds of symptoms. I added the little red box. I had another study that showed 100 yards, so 300 feet from a cell phone, somebody talking on a cell phone, you're getting almost enough radiation. From 300 feet away from somebody else's cell phone, you're getting enough exposure to have these kinds of problems. Again, built up over time, the exposure over time. Now, think about walking down a busy street on a weekday at lunch hour. How many cell phones are operating within 300 feet? How about within 100 feet? Because the closer it is, the higher the impact, the more rays you're getting exposed to. And while all these phones are going off, how much concrete sidewalk, how much asphalt road, how much metal buses or trucks or plate glass windows, these rays are ricocheting all around you. You are being bathed in radiation. And these are the kind of symptoms that you can expect. So why isn't the FCC protecting us? Okay, the FCC guidelines are written as an exposure limit per person and very specific to smart meters at the frequencies that they're operating. The per person limit is about, in their, power density is about 600 is their number. Now the way it gets enforced is not how much are you exposed to walking down the street with all the metal and glass and cell phones. It's enforced in a ridiculous way. Somebody wants to get their smart meter approved, so they apply they do their testing and they submit it to the FCC and they say, see, we're only about 1/3 of the allowed limit. We're only at 200, and the limit says we can be 600. Approved. They get stamped approved and get an FCC ID number. And this goes on for every smart meter, every cell phone, everything you expose to. So how much are you actually getting exposed to when you add up everything that's all been allowed to go to the maximum 600, but you're exposed to dozens or even hundreds of these devices that are all allowed to go up to the 600, and they pass. They're approved. What the FCC guidelines was designed around was the military. They looked at, young, healthy, 6-foot-tall, 200-pound men, and they were looking at their radar stations. How much radar, electromagnetic radiation, can they be exposed to before they start to cook their flesh? They were looking only at heating. They weren't looking at other effects. This is where I say they averaged the emission over 30 minutes because from a heating concern, you can put your hand quickly over a candle and it doesn't burn you. If you start leaving it there, it starts burning you. So the time duration is important when you're looking at heating effects. It's totally irrelevant when you're looking at these other effects. But this is how they designed their guideline, was around not burning up the flesh of young servicemen. They look at protecting from one device alone because, again, the servicemen are servicing this one radar installation, so they're looking at the one device. They're not looking at this multitude of devices you're being exposed to walking down the street. They look at one single exposure. Again, they're looking to keep the heating from reaching this certain point. So this limit is set around, if you're exposed once in your life and never again, what's a safe limit? It's not looking at being exposed all day, every day for the rest of your life. So bottom line, when companies say, oh, we're safe, we meet all the FCC guidelines. Well, okay, so they have FCC compliance. Compliance is not safety, it's just legal. From a 1993 internal FDA memo, it was stated, available data strongly suggest that microwaves can accelerate the development of cancer. They knew that way back then. From a 2002 EPA letter, the FCC's exposure guideline is considered protective of effects arising from a heating mechanism, but not from all possible mechanisms. Therefore, the generalization by many, read all of these device manufacturers, that the guidelines protect human beings from harm by any or all mechanisms is not justified. These guidelines aren't protecting you from the non-thermal, the bioeffects like the communication disruption in your cells. It's not looking at pulse signals as being any different than continuous wave. And just for the record, studies have shown pulse signals are 28 times as damaging as continuous wave signals. They don't look at that momentary peak emission, that little blue star that I had on those spikes. They're not putting a limit on the peak emission, just the average. They're not looking at emissions from other simultaneous devices. They're not adding up the smart meters, the Wi-Fi, the cell phones, everything that you're exposed to as you're sitting in your internet cafe or you're sitting at your Starbucks drinking your latte. They're not looking at the devices added together. They're looking at one device at a time. And they're not looking at the accumulation. You would think that our government would have decided how much you can have, say, over a year's time and be safely exposed. They've never looked at that. There's also no provisions for the very vulnerable, in addition to children, elderly, pregnant women, anybody immune compromised, anybody who has some kind of a chronic illness. All those people are especially vulnerable and are more easily damaged by the microwaves. They also have no provision for the nighttime recovery period. You can put up with a lot of this microwave radiation if you had a chance to get away from it, produce melatonin, and fix the cells that are damaged. If you never get a chance to fix them, you just keep accumulating more and more damage. So how much radiation are we talking about? In 1980, background microwave was about 0.005 on the scale of power density. They call it microwatts per centimeter squared. Now, in urban centers, it's about 0.4 to 100 microwatts per centimeter squared. Background radio frequency radiation has increased 20,000 times. Wireless smart meters, this is before smart meters. This is cities without smart meters. This chart was put together before the smart meters had been rolling out. Wireless smart meters are going to add that layer of red that you saw with the households to this amount. Potential chronic health effects could add to healthcare costs. Prevention is key, the precautionary principle. So what does this all mean to you? FCC regulations do not protect against all effects. Residents' exposure is much higher than admitted by utilities. The low radio frequency radiation mimics and interferes with your cell's communication. It's turning things on that are supposed to be off. It's turning things off that are supposed to be on. RFR is a toxic accumulant. The effects of exposure build up over time. Bottom line, wireless microwave communication is not acceptable for the smart grid. As David talked to you, there are other alternatives. It shouldn't be wireless. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. What we're going to do, we're going to be taking a short intermission, approximately 10 minutes. So it's 8:30. We'd like everyone to be back by 8:40. If you need to use the restrooms, I think the men's out this door and the ladies out the other way. And there is, I think there's food or coffee available upstairs at the top of the stairs if somebody wants to get some.
Jump on one thing.
Yeah.
The federal government, folks, the federal government went to China, borrowed $3.6 billion, put it on your children and grandchildren's credit card, and we have just that little box that's floating around here to promote our issues. They've got $3.6 billion to promote theirs. If you see that little canister, please put a little bit of money in there because we will continue to promote this. So take a break and come on back, we'll finish up. Well, there's one of these meters is right up here too if you want to touch it. It's already touching you.
Oh, excuse me, one other announcement. We do have a mailing list sign-up thing on the clipboard here, and I'm going to, I'll leave it right here on the front table. Anyone who would like to receive further information by email or snail mail, if you give us an email address or snail mail, we'll send it.
Is there a switch over there?